idolized his Molly, and, as Miss Jenkyns used to say, people talk a great deal about idolizing nowadays, whatever that may mean. But this was nothing to a fit of writing classical poetry which soon seized him, in which his Molly figured away as Maria. The letter containing the Carmen was endorsed by her. Hebrew verses sent me by my honored husband. I thought to have had a letter about killing the pig, but must wait. To send the poetry to Sir Peter Arley, as my husband desires. And in a postscriptum note in his handwriting, it was stated that the ode had appeared in the Gentleman's Magazine, December 1782. Her letters back to her husband were more satisfactory to an absent husband and father than his could ever have been to her. She told him how Deborah sewed her seam very neatly every day, and read to her in the books he had set her. How she was a very forward, good child, but would ask questions her mother could not answer, but how she did not let herself down by saying she did not know, but took to stirring the fire, or sending the forward child on an errand. Matty was now the mother's darling, and promised, like her sister at her age, to be a great beauty. I was reading this aloud to Miss Matty, who smiled and sighed a little at the hope, so fondly expressed, that little Matty might not be vain, even if she wore a beauty. "I had very pretty hair, my dear," said Miss Matilda, "and not a bad mouth, and I saw her soon afterwards adjust her cap and draw herself up. But to return to Miss Jenkyns' letters. She told her husband about the poor in the parish, with what homely domestic medicine she had administered, what kitchen physic she had sent. She had evidently held his displeasure as a rod and pickle over the heads of all the ne'er-do-wells. She asked for his directions about the cows and pigs, and did not always obtain them, as I have shown before. The kind old grandmother was dead when a little boy was born, soon after the publication of the sermon, but there was another letter of exhortation from the grandfather, more stringent and admonitory than ever, now that there was a boy to be guarded from the snares of the world. He described all the various sins into which men might fall, until I wondered how any man ever came to a natural death. The gallows seemed as if it must have been the termination of the lives of most of the grandfather's friends and acquaintances, and I was not surprised at the way in which he spoke of this life being a vale of tears. It seemed curious that I should never have heard of his brother before, but I concluded that he had died young, or else surely his name would have been alluded to by his sisters. By and by we came to packets of Miss Jenkyns' letters. These Miss Matty did regret to burn. She said all the others had been only interesting to those who loved the writers, and that it seemed as if it would have hurt her to allow them to fall into the hands of strangers, who had not known her dear mother, and how good she was, although she did not always spell quite in the modern fashion. But Deborah's letters were so very superior. Any one might profit by reading them. It was a long time since she had read Miss Chapone, but she knew she used to think that Deborah could have said the same things quite as well, and as for Miss Carter, people thought a deal of her letters, just because she had written Epictetus, but she was quite sure Deborah would never have made use of such common expressions as "I canna be fashed." Miss Matty did grudge burning these letters. It was evident. She would not let them be carelessly passed over with any quiet reading and skipping to myself. She took them from me, and even lighted the second candle in order to read them aloud with a proper emphasis, and without stumbling over the big words. Oh dear, how I wanted facts instead of reflections before those letters were concluded. They lasted us 2 nights, and I won't deny that I made use of the time to think of many other things, and yet I was always at my post at the end of each sentence. The rector's letters and those of his wife and mother-in-law had all been tolerably short and pithy, written in a straight hand, with the lines very close together. Sometimes the whole letter was contained on a mere scrap of paper. The paper was very yellow, and the ink very brown. Some of the sheets wore, as Miss Matty made me observe, the old original post, with a stamp in the corner representing a postboy riding for life and twanging his horn. The letters of Miss Jenkyns and her mother were fastened with a great round red wafer, for it was before Miss Edgeworth's patronage had banished wafers from polite society. It was evident from the tenor of what was said that francs were in great request, and were even used as a means of paying debts by needy members of Parliament. The rector sealed his epistles with an immense coat of arms, and showed by the care in which he had performed this ceremony that he expected they should be cut open, not broken by any thoughtless or impatient hand. Now, Miss Jenkyns' letters were of a later date in form and writing. She wrote on the square sheet, which we have learned to call old-fashioned. Her hand was admirably calculated, together with her use of many-syllable words to fill up a sheet, and then came the pride and delight of crossing. Poor Miss Matty got sadly puzzled with this, for the words gathered size like snowballs, and towards the end of her letter Miss Jenkyns used to become quite sesquipedalian, and one to her father, slightly theological and controversial in its tone. She had spoken of Herod, Tetrarch of Idumea. Miss Matty read it Herod, Petrarch of Etruria, and was just as well pleased as if she had been right. I can't quite remember the date, but I think it was in 1805 that Miss Jenkyns wrote the longest series of letters, on occasion of her absence on a visit to some friends near Newcastle upon Tyne. These friends were intimate with the commandant of the garrison there, and heard from him of all the preparations that were being made to repel the invasion of Bonaparte, which some people imagined might take place at the mouth of Tyne. Miss Jenkyns was evidently very much alarmed, and the first part of her letter was often written in pretty intelligible English, conveying particulars of the preparations which were made in the family with whom she was residing against the dreaded event. The bundles of clothes that were packed up ready for a flight to Alston Moor, a wild, hilly piece of ground between Northumberland and Cumberland. The signal that was to be given for this flight, and for the simultaneous turning out of the volunteers under arms, which said signal was to consist, if I remember rightly, in ringing the church bells in a particular and ominous manner. One day, when Miss Jenkyns and her host were at a dinner party in Newcastle, this warning summons was actually given. Not a very wise proceeding, if there be any truth in the moral attached to the fable of the boy and the wolf, but so it was. And Miss Jenkyns, hardly recovered from her fright, wrote the next day to describe the sound, the breathless shock, the hurry and alarm, and then, taking breath, she added, "How trivial, my dear father, do all our apprehensions of the last evening appear, at the present moment, to calm and inquiring minds." And here Miss Matty broke in with, "But indeed, my dear, they were not at all trivial or trifling at the time. I know I used to wake up in the night many a time, and think I heard the tramp of the French entering Cranford. Many people talked of hiding themselves in the salt mines, and meat would have kept capitally down there, only perhaps we should have been thirsty. And my father preached a whole set of sermons on the occasion, one set in the mornings, all about David and Goliath, to spirit up the people to fighting with spades or bricks, if need were, and the other set in the afternoons, proving that Napoleon, that was another name for Bonnie, as we all used to call him, was all the same as a Napoleon and a Baden. I remember my father rather thought he should be asked to print this last set, but the parish had, perhaps, had enough of them with hearing." Peter Marmaduke Arl Jenkyns, poor Peter, as Miss Matty began to call him, was at school at Shrewsbury by this time. The rector took up his pen and rubbed up his Latin once more to correspond with his boy. It was very clear that the lads were what are called show letters. They were of highly mental descriptions, giving an account of his studies and his intellectual hopes of various kinds, with an occasional quotation from the classics. But now and then the animal nature broke out in such a little sentence as this, evidently written in a trembling hurry after the letter had been inspected: "Mother dear, do send me a cake, and put plenty of citron in." The mother dear probably answered her boy in the form of cakes and goody, for there were none of her letters amongst this set, but a whole collection of the rector's, to whom the Latin in his boy's letters was like a trumpet to the old war horse. I do not know much about Latin, certainly, and it is, perhaps, an ornamental language, but not very useful, I think, at least to judge from the bits I remember out of the rector's letters. One was, "You have not got that town in your map of Ireland, but bonus Bernardus non videt omnia, as the proverbia say. Presently it became very evident that poor Peter got himself into many scrapes. There were letters of stilted penitence to his father for some wrongdoing, and among them all was a badly written, badly sealed, badly directed, blotted note. My dear, 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 dearest mother, I will be a better boy. I will indeed. But don't, please, be ill for me. I'm not worth it, but I will be good, darling mother. Miss Matty could not speak for crying after she had read this note. She gave it to me in silence, and then got up and took it to her sacred recess in her own room, for fear by any chance it might get burnt. Poor Peter, she said. He was always in scrapes. He was too easy. They led him wrong, and then left him in the lurch. But he was too fond of mischief. He could never resist a joke. Poor Peter. Chapter 5. Poor Peter. Poor Peter's career lay before him rather pleasantly mapped out by kind friends, but bonus Bernardus non videt omnia in this map too. He was to win honors at the Shrewsbury School and carry them thick to Cambridge, and after that a living awaited him, the gift of his godfather, Sir Peter Arley. Poor Peter! His lot in life was very different to what his friends had hoped and planned. Miss Matty told me all about it, and I think it was a relief when she had done so. He was the darling of his mother, who seemed to dote on all her children, though she was, perhaps, a little afraid of Deborah's superior acquirements. Deborah was the favorite of her father, and when Peter disappointed him, she became his pride. The sole honor Peter brought away from Shrewsbury was the reputation of being the best good fellow that ever was, and of being the captain of the school in the art of practical joking. His father was disappointed, but set about remedying the matter in a manly way. He could not afford to send Peter to read with any tutor, but he could read with him himself, and Miss Matty told me much of the awful preparations in the way of dictionaries and lexicons that were made in her father's study the morning Peter began. My poor mother, said she. I remember how she used to stand in the hall, just near enough the study door to catch the tone of my father's voice. I could tell in a moment if all was going right by her face. And it did go right for a long time. What went wrong at last? Said I. That tiresome Latin, I dare say? No, it was not the Latin. Peter was in high favor with my father, for he worked up well for him. But he seemed to think that the Cranford people might be joked about and made fun of, and they did not like it. Nobody does. He was always hoaxing them. Hoaxing is not a pretty word, my dear, and I hope you won't tell your father I used it, for I should not like him to think that I was not choice in my language, after living with such a woman as Deborah. And be sure you ever use it yourself. I don't know how it slipped out of my mouth, except it was that I was thinking of poor Peter, and it was always his expression. But he was a very gentlemanly boy in many things. He was like dear Captain Brown in always being ready to help any old person or a child. Still, he did like joking and making fun, and he seemed to think the old ladies in Cranford would believe anything. There were many old ladies living here then. We are principally ladies now, I know, but we are not so old as the ladies used to be when I was a girl. I could laugh to think of Peter's jokes. No, my dear, I won't tell you of them, because they might not shock you as they ought to do, and they were very shocking. He even took in my father once, by dressing himself up as a lady that was passing through the town and wished to see the rector of Cranford, who had published the admirable assize sermon. Peter said he was awfully frightened himself when he saw how my father took it all in, and even offered to copy out all his Napoleon Bonaparte sermons for her. Him, I mean. No, her, for Peter was a lady then. He told me he was more terrified than he ever was before, all the time my father was speaking. He did not think my father would have believed him, and yet if he had not, it would have been a sad thing for Peter. As it was, he was none so glad of it, for my father kept him hard at work copying out all those 12 Bonaparte sermons for the lady. That was for Peter himself, you know. He was the lady. And once he wanted to go fishing, Peter said, "Confound the woman." Very bad language, my dear, but Peter was not always so guarded as he should have been. My father was so